My name is Denisha Brown, and I'm a member of the team here at the Center for Health Equity Transformation. We have an awesome presentation plan for you today for Juneteenth. We're going to get started shortly with our audio and visual presentation, but we'll give folks a few more minutes to get into the Zoom room and get settled before we get started. So hi, everyone. My name is Denisha. I'm a member of the team at the Center for Health Equity Transformation, where our mission is to lift health for all by exposing root causes for health inequities and serving as a hub that pushes boundaries in research, education, workforce development, and in community engagement. Thank you for joining us for the 2023 Juneteenth celebration of Black culture, art, and music, and a thoughtful discussion of persistent health disparities experienced by the Black community, featuring Arline Geronimus, Burnett-Zeigler, and Iman Lauren. Juneteenth is the celebration of the end of slavery in the westernmost Confederate state of Texas. Though the Emancipation Proclamation was effective in 1863, freedom did not come to all enslaved people until June 19, 1865. Juneteenth has been celebrated by African Americans since the 1800s, despite only being designated a federal holiday in 2021. Today, we will celebrate Black culture through visual, spoken, and musical art. In the words of the Chicago neighborhood historian Sherman Dilla Thompson, everything dope about America comes from Chicago. So we've elected to highlight local artistry throughout today's program. First, we'll begin with our audio-visual presentation of local Black artists synced to a playlist curated by DJ Stazi, who we affectionately know on the chat team as Anastasia. Following that presentation, we'll transition to a brief presentation about weathering by Dr. Arline Geronimus and a Q&A moderated by Dr. Burnett-Zeigler. Our program will conclude with a spoken word performance with Iman Lauren. A few housekeeping items to note: you've been muted upon entering the meeting. We ask that you leave your audio off during the event. Without further delay, let's begin the audio and visual presentation. Please support the artists featured by scanning the corresponding QR codes. The playlist will be available and shared after today's event. So we hope you enjoyed that presentation of Black expression through visual and musical art. We'll make sure to share the details for the playlist and also share the recording for those of you who may be interested, because it was an additional 7 minutes that we weren't able to get to. So next I'll introduce Drs. Burnett-Zeigler and Geronimus, and the next voice that you'll hear will be that of Dr. Geronimus. Dr. Burnett-Zeigler is a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. She has 2 decades of clinical experience helping people with stress, trauma, mood, and anxiety conditions and difficulty in interpersonal relationships. In her clinical practice, she promotes holistic wellness through mindfulness, self-compassion, and healthy behavior change. Inger's scholarly work focuses on the role that social determinants of health play in mental illness and treatment, particularly in the Black community. She is the author of the book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, The Emotional Lives of Black Women. She has written dozens of articles and other publications on mental health in the Black community and lectures widely on barriers to access and engagement in mental health treatment, mindfulness, and strategies to improve mental health outcomes and participation in treatment. Inger is an advocate for normalizing participation in mental health treatment and ensuring that all individuals have access to high quality, evidence-based mental health care. She is an active contributor to the public discourse on mental health, and she was featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, and Chicago Tribune. Inger received her undergraduate degree in psychology from Cornell University, her doctorate in clinical psychology from Northwestern University, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the VA Ann Arbor University of Michigan. She lives in Chicago. Dr. Arline Geronimus, author of Weathering the Extraordinary Stress of Ordinary Life in an Unjust Society, is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and is currently a professor of public health at the University of Michigan. Dr. Geronimus received her undergraduate degree in political theory from Princeton University, her doctorate in behavioral sciences from the Harvard Medical School of Public Health and her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School. Winner of many awards throughout her career. Most recently, she was the 2002 recipient of the James S. Jackson Distinguished Career Award for Diversity Scholarship from the National Center for Institutional Diversity. And weathering, based on more than 30 years of research, Dr. Geronimus argues that health and aging have more to do with how society treats us than how we will take care of ourselves. Until now, there has been little discussion about the insidious effects of social justice on the body. Weathering shifts the paradigms, shining a light on the topic, and offering a roadmap for health. Help me in welcoming Dr. Geronimus.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and in the presence of people who are concerned about our growing, well, entrenched and in some cases growing health inequities between dominant and marginalized groups that are most consistently seen in simple comparisons of African Americans to white Americans. And I believe we've been going about trying to reduce and ultimately eliminate those health inequities in all the wrong ways. But I am also here to suggest a new way to think about it, which is what my book, Weathering, is about. So let me begin with a story. The pathologist who did the autopsy for Martin Luther King Jr. noted that Martin Luther King Jr. had a heart of a 69-year-old, although he was 39 years old when he died. His damaged heart was certainly a curiosity to those who read the autopsy report and was noted in that official record. But there was no question, obviously, as to the cause of Dr. King's death: homicide, indeed assassination, a racial hate crime. But if we were to try to understand the poor condition of his heart, which should also be concerning, we might be flummoxed given our limited repertoire for thinking about heart disease and health inequities in heart disease. Our general social repertoire for understanding such early onset of heart disease points us to individual demographic and behavioral risk factors like poverty, low education, so-called family breakdown, unhealthy diet, and too little exercise. If you look at King, he certainly looked physically fit, capable of leading miles-long marches for civil rights. He was well-educated, not impoverished. He grew up in a so-called intact household and had a strong father figure. His faith was unswerving, and he certainly had a sense of purpose. He had a loving wife and family by all accounts. So we might ask then, if we stick to our limited repertoire, did he partake of an unhealthy diet? Did he have a genetic predisposition or a family history of heart disease? From our limited knowledge about him per se, we cannot rule out or rule in such possibilities. Yet the more likely explanation, I would argue, is that chronic stress and exhaustion took a toll on his heart. But what does that really mean? Would his heart have been healthy if he had managed it with stress and meditation? We don't know that he didn't. Or if he reduced his travel and public engagements to get more rest? Perhaps a bit. But his calling towards being active in the civil rights movement may well have been greater than his inclination toward radical self-care. After all, there was and is a lot of work to be done, even if it placed him in harm's way. His exhausting activities also gave his life purpose and meaning and helped advance our nation toward racial justice. Moreover, what I want to stress is that even the most conscientious self-care routines or personally enforced scheduling boundaries would not alone have addressed the source of what I believe were likely to be King's most severe and chronic stressors. The fact that he lived continuously on alert to threats, maintaining his composure nonetheless, and in survival mode. This chronic vigilance and adaptation takes a huge health toll on the human biological canvas through a structurally rooted biopsychosocial process that I named weathering. After almost 40 years of research in public health and a lifetime of wrestling with questions of racial and class injustice, I have concluded that this process of weathering is critical to understanding why someone like King, whom we consider young and healthy by all conventional measures, would have the damaged heart of someone approaching old age. Weathering afflicts human bodies cumulatively, and it does so all the way down to the cellular level. As people grow, develop, and age in a systemically and historically racist, classist, stigmatizing, or xenophobic society. Weathering damages our critical body systems, tissues, and organs in ways that leave oppressed people vulnerable to dying far too young, whether from infectious diseases like COVID-19 or the early onset and pernicious progression of chronic diseases like hypertension or heart disease. Because of the physiological impacts of unrelenting exposure to stressors in one physical, social, and ideological environment. And that's very important because many people don't talk about how an ideological environment activates harmful biological processes, and yet I think that's key. As well as the high physiological effort that coping with chronic stressors entails, weathering means that relatively young people in oppressed, marginalized, or exploited groups can be biologically old. To understand weathering, we must first understand the power differentials and psychosocial dynamics between the dominant culture and marginalized groups in our inequitable society. The practices, values, language, and common sense of a dominant group in a multicultural society are deemed to be the authoritative knowledge in a society. Now, authoritative knowledge does not mean it's true or correct or evidence-based. Authoritative knowledge in a society means the knowledge that counts, whether or not it's true. And remember that the cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz wrote about common sense. Very often authoritative knowledge is also common sense. When people say it's common sense that, the reason they can get away with saying that, even if it's not true, is because it trades on authoritative knowledge. So common sense is not what the mind cleared of Kant spontaneously apprehends. It is what the mind filled with presuppositions concludes. And in many instances, I would extend this definition to expert opinion, as well as just someone speaking from, quote, common sense. Racialization is a powerful means by which the dominant culture sets groups apart as more or less deserving of, or entitled to resources, esteem, or power, or instead as worthy of contempt, punishment, deprivation, stigma, oppression, and exploitation. The distinction between a racialized group and a race is fundamental to understanding weathering. It is not what we call race per se that impacts health. There's nothing essential about being Black, for example, that makes Black people inherently vulnerable to poor health. Rather, it is society's racialization of Black people as being essentially inferior in a white supremacist world, irresponsible, deficient, naturally suited to harmful occupations. All of these have been applied as authoritative knowledge throughout US history, or insensitive to physical pain, if we're talking about healthcare, and the largest one as threatening. A classification scheme in which both dominant and marginal group people are fluent, and that's also key. Now, dominant group people see it as common sense and expert opinion. I'm not suggesting that marginalized people see it that, but they're very well aware of those beliefs that infiltrate and pervade their society, and that many people who have power or act or provide access to opportunities or take care of them as teachers or doctors or lawyers or whatever, hold these beliefs at least implicitly, if not explicitly, though often explicitly. I think we sort of cop a plea when we just talk about it as if it's all implicit bias, as opposed to very explicit belief. And the fact that people hold these beliefs and that the people oppressed and exploited by them are also fluent in these beliefs is part of what leads to health harm and what I'm referring to as stressors. To racialize is to create a social identity based on a group's common superficial physical characteristics, ancestry, or national origin. Once identified, a racialized group can be portrayed in terms that naturalize their oppression, exploitation, and exclusion. Once identified through the same classification systems, members of more powerful groups can view themselves as superior, responsible, and deserving. This pervasive social dynamic of superiority and inferiority, power and oppression sets differently racialized groups on diverging health trajectories, leading to shorter or longer healthy life expectancies. So reorienting our understanding of an approach to health equity so as to include weathering implications of active and sustained racialization, I believe, is essential if we are to realize the now widely shared ambition in the US to eliminate population inequities in health. Many scholars, writers, and activists are beginning to address the material, educational, legal, political, and environmental injustices caused by systemic racism. And that's great, but it's not enough, especially if we're thinking about health. So let me talk about weathering and how it adds an important piece of the puzzle, a truth to which I've really dedicated my career. That the ideologies that sustain the racialization and other forms of cultural oppression, racism, classism, sexism, ageism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, have real measurable consequences for health above and beyond the economic and educational inequities they create that give some people more resources and opportunities than others, or that segregate people into well-resourced or disinvested and environmentally toxic neighborhoods. The accidents of birth that each of us, that assign each of us to either a socially valued, dominant, or marginalized group can impact life expectancy, not just through these obvious social and economic and physical environmental determinants, but also through the slow and sometimes very pressured and fast drip or stream of stealth ideas about race and personal responsibility that we share as a society. So my research finds that pervasive and classist ideologies activate biological processes that over time wear out the physical and mental health of people of color across all economic classes, if to different degrees. In a particularly perverse irony, Black people who have advanced or achieved a measure of socioeconomic security or socioeconomic mobility, and those who most actively counter the concrete threats of racism to their well-being and live in sync with core American values of, quote, working hard and playing by the rules across all classes, face unique assaults on their health. Weathering explains how and why racial inequities in health persist across class lines. So let me explain. The inner workings of our bodies or let me explain the mechanisms, biological mechanisms I'm referring to. The inner workings of our bodies are always active and adapting, physiologically responding to necessary to changes, challenges, and threats in our environment, whether they be objective biological stressors, such as being, freezing or breathing in toxic fumes regularly, or an acute threat to life or limb, which is the classic fight or flight, which I'll speak a little more about in a moment, or to threats to our safety or survival, much more broadly defined. Human bodies have evolved to react to potential or concrete life-threatening stressors in our environment. There's the classic fight or flight or freeze response that most people have at least heard of. You see a tiger heading your way, your body immediately activates a release of stress hormones that increase your heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing rate to propel oxygenated blood to your large muscles quickly. But at the same time, body systems or tissues and organs that are not going to help you fight or flee as large muscles will, are deprived of nutrients and oxygen for the duration of the threat. If you're pregnant, that means your fetus, which is a drag on your body if it's trying to fight or flee, will also be deprived of oxygen and nutrients during this time. Now, if you survive the confrontation with the tiger and successfully escape, in a matter of a few minutes, your body systems will return to their usual functions. The stress hormones recede, the sugar and fat and white blood cells, they catapulted into your bloodstream for energy and to prepare for wound recovery, go back to their storage sites. The body quickly returns to pre-arousal stress hormone levels. Adequate oxygen and nutrition are circulated throughout your body. And if you're pregnant, to your fetus, again, your body quickly recovers from this archetypal acute episode of being attacked by a tiger, or worrying you're being attacked by a tiger. Key to weathering, the threat that activates that physiological stress response does not have to take the form of a raging beast. Physiological stress processes are set in motion when any kind of danger is anticipated or experienced, whether it's objective, probabilistic, environmental, or psychosocial. Key to survival in a threatening environment is to be vigilant to cues all alerting you to possible threat, and being cued to the possibility of threat automatically activates these physiological stress processes when you anticipate even the possibility of harm. So even when it's a false alarm, it's much better to react to a false alarm than to miss a true alarm if you're in a community that lives with a lack of safety of all kinds, whether that's living in a community that is over-policed or under-policed, or in an unsafe built environment, or even as a professional, if you have reason to fear that you are adversely stereotyped as an affirmative action hire and must remain vigilant in your identity management and code switching at work every day in and day out, to avoid job loss or to be accepted or recognized for your talents and work ethic. In a racist system, people of color find themselves in potentially unsafe places, whether this is because of the communities they live in, the schools they go to, or the professions in which they work. And members of racialized groups are vigilant to these ideological threats. Research in social psychology tells us that members of stigmatized groups enter new situations with uncertainty. That's related to being on alert because you have reason to know that there are many unsafe spaces you negotiate in your life, even if the specific one you're entering is not going to be unsafe. It's still is reasonable for it to feel potentially unsafe to you and for you to be vigilant to cues of whether it is or is not unsafe. They are uncertain about whether those they interact with will judge them according to stereotypes related to their social identity. If they know they are members of a marginalized or stigmatized group, or could be seen or outed as one, they automatically become vigilant for cues indicating whether or not they belong, can trust others, can be authentic, or will be treated fairly. This vigilance itself, this sort of anticipatory vigilance, sets physiological stress processes in motion. Whether mediated through such racialized profiling or by objective stressors like environmental racism and hunger, or by long-term emotional and cognitive engagement with social injustice, whether working as a social movement activist like Dr. King, or persistently imploring your apparently indifferent or deaf landlord to turn up the heat in winter or the air conditioning in summer to bearable temperatures, your state of vigilance and stress arousal becomes chronic. In these circumstances, the elevated production of stress hormones does not recede because the challenges never recede, and you must remain vigilant to and engaged in your circumstances. Physiological stress processes become a daily part of ordinary life. Your physiological stress process is rarely, if ever, completely deactivated, not even when you are sleeping, because during sleep, your elevated heart rate can be sustained. Your body has no opportunity to recover. The sugar and fat and white blood cells, the stress response catapulted into your bloodstream, stay circulating there. The tissues and organs that were neglected stay neglected. Your large muscles remain overworked. Your vigilance and alert systems are on speed dial endlessly. This sustained physiological stress process activation takes a pernicious toll across the major systems of the body, the neuroendocrine system, the cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, and the immune system. In turn, this wear and tear leads to hypertension, plaque buildup, pulmonary embolism, enlarged hearts, heart attacks, heart failure or stroke, insulin resistance, and diabetes, among many, many other chronic conditions. Wear and tear on the immune system weakens or dysregulates it, increasing your susceptibility to both infectious and autoimmune diseases. As you age, at least from the womb through middle age, your body systems, tissues, and organs become dysregulated and ultimately worn down, leaving your health increasingly vulnerable to a wide range of illnesses, as well as early health-induced disability or death. Obviously, when that's paired with lack of access to equitable health systems or quality medical care, it can be a truly lethal combination. So weathering, again, just to move towards conclusion, not quite conclude yet, is a structurally rooted, chronic, stress-related biological process that leaves marginalized or exploited Americans vulnerable to dying or suffering infectious and chronic disease and disability long before they are chronologically old. So let me conclude by emphasizing that weathering is not measured in number of steps walked, cigarette smoked, opioids used, alcohol drunk, or calories eaten. It's not primarily measured by your years of education, the size of your paycheck, or your bank balance, though these can be protective in some ways. It's not about emotional despair either. Weathering is a price paid by hopeful, responsible, skilled, and resilient people dying from the physical toll of constant stress on their bodies, paying with their health because they live in a racist, rigged, degrading, and exploitative system that people who have more power and resources think they deserve or see as common sense, or in some cases, proliferate through expert opinion. So if we're committed to health equity, as I know we all are, it's long past time to admit that the inadequacy of our conventional approaches and the ways they privilege the privileged and erase the lived experiences of people of color. We need to take our efforts in new, historically informed, and evidence-based directions. In our system, unearned benefits for some and undue burdens for others will continue to be the rule and tax the health of the burdened, no matter our good intentions or ambitions, until we all see and reject certain core American myths and racist ideology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Geronimus, for that incredible presentation. Admittedly, while I was listening to you, I found myself feeling a little bit stressed, thinking about kind of the totality of the challenges that you were outlining. I'm going to take moderator privilege and ask the first question. I've been furiously scribbling notes, so I'm going to try and quickly bring my notes into one question, which I believe overlaps with the first question in the Q&A. So I really appreciate you starting off your presentation using Martin Luther King as an example and laying out that while we might assume that some of what we would call his individual risk factors might have been, limited, he was living within this structural high stress environment that, though not the direct cause of death, we have evidence was contributing to accelerated aging. And so then you go on to talk about all of the stressors, right? All of the environmental stressors, outlining stereotype threat, identity management, code switching, neighborhood environment, and the impact that that has on the physical body, which I think is really key in understanding the role of systems and environment on health. I, as an individual, I, as a psychologist, focus on how individuals manage stress. And I appreciated you highlighting the effort that's involved in that process of coping with stress. And as a researcher, I too think about this context that you're describing. So that's a long wind up to ask, what do we do, right? Because even, I as a psychologist, even though I'm helping people to, develop these tools and skills to manage both the psychological and physiological impact of the environments that they're living in, I realize that they're still going back to these environments that have, deeply embedded structures and systems that will continue to negatively impact physical and mental health. So in the moment, what would be your recommendations for people? Changing systems is big work, big problem, long-term chipping away. What are your kind of thoughts or recommendations for how people cope with these structurally rooted chronic stress related processes, also known as weathering?
Okay. I have a few answers, none of which will be totally satisfying. I believe you can only go so far with individual attempts. And I know that goes against all our beliefs about agency and power and individual health behavior change. But that's actually part of the problem, the sense that our system expects us all to individually take personal responsibility for our health, and therefore interprets when whole populations have poor health that there's something wrong with their culture or their intelligence, or so there's a kind of, we've all been sort of age washed to believe that if we just do these things and do them conscientiously, we will be healthy, barring an accident or some fluke in our genes, but we have enormous power to be healthier. We just don't. However, in public health, we do talk about primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. And what I'm saying is none of the things we're doing are going to get to the root causes, and therefore they will not be primary prevention. What they can do is be secondary or tertiary prevention. For example, access to health services, but won't stop a person from having weathered who has lived under this oppression, but it may stop them from dying too early. And that's pretty good, thing to do. I'm not saying abandon health services, abandon self-care. I'm also think that to the extent you can, try to do the things that I'm imagining you advocate for your clients, that will be helpful at least a little. But it's not, it doesn't, and that's worth something. But at the same time, it's not going to end weathering. And if it makes people feel, and I've gotten a lot of emails to this effect, I am told both, it's very hard for me to know how to pitch my talks, because on the one hand, I understand what I'm saying is stressful and can be triggering. And that's not my goal at all. But I've gotten emails to that effect from some people and from some of my students. But at the same time, I've gotten at least as many emails of people saying it was learning this so directly was a source of major relief, because they had thought they were personally responsible for, and even though they had tried so hard to follow all the healthy lifestyle choices or to get a good education or all the things we say they need to do, they still have health problems, and that's due to the systemic and structurally rooted racism, and in the case of weathering, the way it's mediated through the body. And so I had a woman come up to me once in tears saying that she had had an infant death 30 years before and had lived with guilt all these 30 years, wondering what she did wrong. She didn't know what she did wrong, but we have so pressed this idea that you must, and especially mothers, do things wrong, that she had not been able to grieve the loss or relieve herself of this feeling of guilt until she heard about weathering. So I do think helping people understand that it's not something wrong with you, but it's something that happens to you, and often in ways that are historically entrenched and well beyond your individual control. So then what can you do? Well, in my book, I write about a variety of small to larger things we might do. I write about things we're doing that we shouldn't be doing, even though we think they, will lead to more racial equity. And I also think we have to think about how to use this information towards being social activists, political activists who we vote for, how we think of policies. We now have many states require, and even some federal policies require racial equity and health impact statements, but we have to, and they use words like structural and systemic, but we have to include these weathering and coping with stressors as part of understanding what are the health impacts. We can't rest on the laurels that now that we're structurally woke, we know to have supermarkets in, disinvested urban areas that carry fresh vegetables. That's just not enough, and it's politically fragile. So I think it's a sobering lesson, but what I like to think of it as is, there's a joke about the person who's looking for his car keys that he's lost under the street lamp near his car, and somebody asks, but not finding them, and somebody asks him, did you drop them here? And he says, no, but this is where the light is. I feel this question of what can we do as individuals is sort of like that. Our narratives of the last at least 40 years, and in some ways 400 years, have put that streetlight on certain at best inadequate and even harmful ways to try to solve these problems or to be healthy. I'm hoping that weathering, and this is why I wrote the book, to make it more accessible. I'm hoping that weathering leads us to look in other places that actually our proverbial car keys are more likely to be.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love that image of kind of widening the scope of where we're shining the light. We have a couple questions in the chat about measuring weathering in clinical or research settings. How to?
There's obviously no literal measure of weathering. Weathering, precisely in part because, depending on what variety of systemic or structural stressors is causing your weathering will lead to different degrees of weathering or work in slightly different ways or through slightly different organs and body systems. And also the historical moment you're living in, or whether you're being exposed to a COVID-19 virus, or whether you're having, a baby. All of these things affect how much you have weathered, how much you will weather during the time of COVID or during your gestation, and the consequences of that weathering. The way I've done research is I've looked at a whole range of stressors and how they're associated with health outcomes. So sometimes it's simply, and I've relied a lot on the different rates of aging of Black, if we're talking about Black and white, we've also looked at other populations of Black and white people as an indicator of weathering. More recently, I've been working on this for 40 years, but in the last, say, 10, 20 years, we've had measures of actual stress responses. We've had measures of what's called allostatic load, which is stress-mediated wear and tear on your body. So it's actually probably the closest thing to an objective measure of weathering or how weathered you are. We've worked down to the cellular level and looked at telomere length, which is also telomere length. Without taking too long to explain it, telomeres are the caps on chromosomes, and they shorten each time a cell divides until they get to a point where the cell dies or enters replicative senescence. And in some ways, it's a measure of biological aging. We've looked at the role of stress in telomere shortening, again, the rate at which people age. We've looked at how it differs in different populations and subject to different stressors. All of these other researchers have looked at what's called epigenetic aging, which is another biological test of your biological age. And so putting all this together, all the results, some in experimental studies. So some of the studies, say with stereotype threat, have been experimental. People are randomly assigned, for instance, to take a test under stereotype threat condition or not. And those who are under stereotype threat condition perform much more poorly than those who aren't. Well, why do I bring that up? Not only because it will limit somebody's chances of doing well in school or in their profession, but also because the reason it does that is it starts this stress response and activates more of the emotional centers of your brain and less of the cognitive centers of your brain, which is why you perform more poorly. But I would think about not just the performance in that one moment in time, but what it's doing to your body if you're constantly being in a stereotype threat condition.
Thank you for that. This next question I'm interpreting is somewhat related to this idea of measurement. It's asking about your impressions of healthcare providers' awareness of the process of weathering. And I want to add on to that question, particularly in the maternal healthcare space. You alluded to that a couple times in your talk about the role of weathering among those who are pregnant. So I wonder if you can comment on that awareness, measurement, kind of applications of what you've been describing among providers.
I think most providers are not aware of weathering, and certainly there's not this simple clinical lab test, they can do. Although they might look at allostatic load, or I wouldn't suggest looking at telomere length, because on an individual level, it's pretty hard to know what that means. But more importantly, I think they need, and again, this is one of the purposes of the book, if any clinicians read it, is to be aware that weathering happens. It can happen very severely. It definitely happens inequitably, and it really critiques some of our beliefs about if we're talking about the maternal health space, what's the most appropriate time to have a baby. We have a belief in this country that no one younger than 20 should have a baby, or bear a baby, and that the longer you wait so that you can get more education and higher and more secure income, or own a house in a safe environment, the better. And so we as a country have moved to most of our first births happening in the 30s, where up until 2016, as recently as 2016, there were more in the 20s, or between 18 and 30. I think that, and I think there's the strongest research to support what I'm about to say, in part because I started studying weathering in the context of maternal child health. And so I've been doing that for 40 full years, unlike some other conditions and diseases, which I've started working on more recently. I think there's basically irrefutable evidence that for women who are weathered, their risks of poor infant outcome, or their own risk of morbidity or mortality during pregnancy or delivery, or even in the first months postpartum, is increased by postponing childbearing, really beyond the late teens and early 20s. I know that sounds like, heresy, but that's an example. And I'm not saying, and I don't think its policy implication is we should encourage people to become teen mothers who are in weathered populations. But I think it's the fact that we feel it's heresy, or I was once called the biggest threat to youth in this country for having said that, is it precisely the kind of hegemonic belief we have that there's this thing that's real called teenage pregnancy, that on the one hand, that anyone aged 13 through 19 is at the same risks, that most teen moms are more 13 to 15, the so-called babies having babies. None of that is true. There's every reason to believe having a baby at 13 is very different than 18 or 19, especially if you're in a weathered population, because each year of age, your risks increase. There's no such thing as just as race is a social construct, being a teenage mother is a social construct, and it's vague and misleading. It makes you think the woman is biologically unprepared for childbearing, when these structural forces that wear away at her health are more important in some populations. It makes you think that at 20 you're magically going to be able to have healthy babies when you couldn't at 19. There's something just patently ridiculous or magical about that thinking. Our other magical thinking is that ignores this structural racism, is this idea that if you as an individual get more education, maybe a profession and a higher paying job, you have to do that before you have a baby, as opposed to us putting the structural supports in place for people to do them together or in the opposite sequence. And that because you have more money or health insurance or live in a healthier physical environment, because you've become accomplished, that even though you're now 38 when you're having your first baby, that baby and you will be healthier. It's just not true. And more people are coming to realize that, having seen the just criminal rate of maternal deaths that have gone up over the last 30 years and have included many highly accomplished Black women who postpone childbearing to the mid to late 30s.
I'm sure you've got my wheels turning with that, as I'm sure
I'm
many
sorry.
audience. No, that's in a
Maternal death is still very rare,
Yeah,
and we should think
yeah.
of it more as an indicator of weathering than as a fact of life that has to happen if you wait till you're 36 to have a baby and you're Black.
Sure.
So, but people went in completely the wrong direction in thinking about how to reduce racial inequities in maternal and infant health. And we've also shown through simulation exercise, sort of statistical exercises, that increased rates of Black infant and maternal mortality are almost entirely due to the increase in age at first birth.
Wow. Well, unless Araceli tells me no, I'm going to squeeze in one more question before we transition. And this question is around an attendee is asking about where strengths and resilience fit into this framework that you're describing.
I know this is supposed to be a celebration, and I understand I'm sort of bringing us all down, but I believe you have to speak truth or nothing will get better. I believe there's ample evidence of incredible resilience in the groups who weather. I don't think we need to be teaching people resilience or counting them as less resilient because they have, say, health problems or get worn out. That high effort coping itself it's both shelter and storm. It's resilience, it's how you survive and maybe even in some ways thrive despite structural racism. But it also, it's the people who stay in school, in the face of all kinds of racist barriers, who advance their education, even though they're spending their days code switching and feeling unaffirmed and disrespected, who have hard times negotiating institutions that were never made for them or with their needs in mind. That's resilience, but that also is weathering. So I think we have to just stop thinking there's one silver bullet, whether it's resilience, whether it's getting a good education or a high income, whether it's putting a supermarket, a Whole Foods in your neighborhood. That is going to work to reduce or eliminate weathering, or that can take the place of the structural sources of weathering that we all have to be committed to ending, and which lead us to, even on an individual level, if we're high on resilience, we may also be high on weathering because of that resilience. It's not that resilience is totally good or having a high income is totally good in terms of your health.
Thank you for the incredible presentation, for your career of work in this area, and for the insights that you've shared with us today. I know that we're all so grateful to have spent this time with you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Geronimus and Burnett-Zeigler. Gave us a lot to think about and really challenged us as members of society and then also as researchers about how we can be better just all the way around in addressing weathering. So now We're going to transition. We're going to take a hard turn for the final part of our presentation with Iman Lauren, who is a product of the West and South Sides of Chicago. And she's also Chicago's first Youth Laureate poet. Iman Lauren has been featured in Chicago Magazine, the Chicago Tribune, and Vogue Magazine. Her work has appeared in the Breakbeat Poet Anthology Series, Volumes 1 and 2, Poetry Foundation Magazine, and elsewhere. She's a member of Young Chicago Authors Teaching Artist Corps and hosts her podcast, The Real Hoodwives of Chicago. Her first book of poems, Commando, was published in 2017. So with that, I am more than excited to turn it over to you, Iman.
Yes, peace everybody. Happy Thursday, gang, gang, all that shit. I am so happy to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for allowing me to present alongside you. The work that you all were discussing is work that I'm very passionate about. I'm an artist, educator, hood womanist. That meaning that the work that I talk about, especially in my poetic inflictions and influences, really breaks down the idea of like womanism versus feminism. I understand that the contemporary feminist movement didn't belong to like Black, queer, Indigenous women. And so when we have like movements like womanism, understanding that that is a different plight and a different fight. And the more that we are intersectionalized, what other places that give us to. And so my work encompasses that. I'm really excited to be reading some poems with you all. I have some new poems I would like to read, and also some poems from my book, Commando, that I'm very happy to share with you. My first poem is called Call Me. Call me, Ishmael, pretty, girl, boy, one, blue, not, tied, tired, wanting, frayed, water, sprayed, ice, rice, nice, everything. Call me staple, bread, butter, thick, pickle, fickle, dill, bitter, bite, bust down, hold on. Call me off, call me rip, call me hot, hopscotch, fire burn, red, new name, engine, loud, roaring, wide, open, teeth, mark, pierced skin, flesh greedy, needing, wanting, finding ways, removing unnecessary, resolved, clueless, then more, other, this, that, too smart. Call me home, call me arrival, call me decline, estimate, second, guess, dial tone, death, heart, eyes shut, close, passageway, call me next, call me step, call me sister, mother, father, gone, alone, tomorrow, don't come, call back, call out, call dipped below, above, sky, hell, even, fair, hear, heard, who, you. Thank you. Cool. This next poem that I'm going to read is called The Womb's Prayer, which is a remix poem after the Lord's Prayer. This poem was written after having an abortion myself, and so I feel like it would be received well in this space. The Womb's Prayer. Give me today a pregnancy test. Help me to piss and stress straight. Though I walk through the valley of Planned Parenthood, I shall fear no sterile weapon or spermicide. Hallowed be thy name, and now body. Barren, make me a broken magic trick. Abracadabra acrobat with an 8:30 appointment. Now she here, now she sedated. Heavenly Father who ain't mine or my child's, make me a murderer and mother all at once. Forgive my sin and flourish, for I am here and I am Black and my blood has stopped. Heavenly Father who give, I've made a Black child and a possible indictment. May the sheeps on these walls keep these thick thighs narrowed. May today be not another body lost, but saved. Thank you. Cool. I'm gonna read another new poem for you all. I'm talking about sex and relationships. A lot of my work that I do, especially on my talk show, really talks about the relationships between sexism, racism, classism, things of that nature. And the nuances of where those conversations really live, if I'm being brutally honest, because we think that they are living and existing as much as we would like to, in respect to the panel. But what does it look like to have those unedited, unwashed, unmasked conversations like on the porches of Inglewood and things like that? So this poem kind of inspired about when those lines are crossed. It's called When I Am the Line Crossed. Nothing good comes at 2 a.m, he says to me on Easter, as I cry in his parents' church. I'm filled with crumpled bags, loose tongues, and men's hands I didn't ask for or consent to. The other Black woman of the room said it was okay. She's been through worse and he is just a baby. She cools for the white man who clearly knows better, and everyone else does too, including me, the owner of the crib, gives me apologies and more lines to keep me talking and quiet. His homie tries to tell him he is wrong, while everyone is around him throwing pronouns like the air in the body isn't moving and violating. The worst I have been through is never discussed or correlating why I'm so peaceful or choose to demand my apologies in private. But he disrespected you in public. You gotta get loud with them. I know, she thinks, dismissing every potential thing they would blame me for. I could yell and ruin the fun for all, or call him my man, which the other men argue is the only reason why I shouldn't be touched. He says she has always been used as a measurement. They can see how far they can travel and how deep she controls what is forgiven. If nothing is ever flashed above us or given its attention on purpose, every accident is perpetuated and passageway for the next harm. The culture preset here always involved me to be prey. Eloquent and forward-thinking folks of the rooms are traps, netted clues for a safe space with a touch of hood, aware of what is happening in the world and how we all fall into the nuance. And there really is no nuance of consent. It's either there or it ain't. Nothing good is already there at 2 a.m. I'm leaving, disappointed in myself. And what good is leaving feeling the smartest if more than my thoughts are picked apart? I leave in the car with my violator, and the woman is staring. Conversation is over, and the lights change in warning to slow down, and I am in the back seat, burning of bright yellow. Thank you. Awesome. I have one more poem to perform with you all. Thank you all so much for being here, for allowing me to be in this space with you all. This poem is the last poem of my book. It's called Commando Manifesto. When I wrote Commando, it was really about the reclamation of being open and being broad and being aware of your bodies and all the things that your bodies are attached to. And I wrote this poem, and I hope that it resonates with you all. It's called Commando Manifesto. I wear my heart on my sleeves, and I don't wear them much, because Chicago rips them right off of you. So I like to get naked. Now I'm a chested tube top, my shoulders of skyscrapers open, ready for a kiss, ready for a blow, a job I can finish. 'Cause mom calls me a clever girl, said I would figure it out, taught me to get out and be open, so I stripped, gave niggas what they've been asking for, kept plenty of blade in my tongue, might have needs that make pain or take it away. I've learned my place and made it a throne. I fuck royally, turned my bed into a mausoleum of offerings. My body is a sacrifice of my winnings, my trophies out in the open. Who the fuck should I lay bare other than myself? So I choose to be commando, ready for action, ready to fight. For this land is mine, and it's still rich, and it's still ours, me, and whoever I choose to be with, for whatever reason. They call it a weak move, a vulnerable venture card, a roadmap of all my soft spots, easy targets. But here is where I plant my flag, because here might have been a pit stop for niggas who needed a home too. Chicago's bosom been sagging on them for a while now, so I give mine. Cook some meals, roll some blunts, and fuck for free, cause that love shit costs nowadays. Ain't much up for profit anyway, but people still find a way. Use my name, try to turn me into a gentrified zone. Throw some good words around me, add a splash of color, give me a stage and say work, bitch. I add the work, bitch. Some crack music, some real Black ruthless. Grind my pretty and I talk real well. Deposit my dialects, spit shine the ground I walk on, for this is mine and nobody can take me. Thank you so much, Northwestern and Health Center Quality Chats. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Iman.
Thank you. I understand it's time. Please follow me, Ella Renee Polo. I'll put it in the chats. And yeah, I do hella shit for Black people. So fuck with me, you know. Happy Juneteenth, niggas and nons. I love you. Thank you, Denise. Peace.
Thank you, Iman. We appreciate you. Thank you for your vulnerability. And with that, we're going to call this Juneteenth celebration to a close. We want to thank all of our artists, presenters, and thank you for the amazing discussion with Dr. Geronimus and Dr. Burnett-Zeigler. Again, we're going to make sure that we share the curated playlist that our DJ Stazi has put together and recording of the event. And again, we're just super happy that as many of you all were able to stay with us for most of today's program. So have a happy Thursday and have a happy Juneteenth celebration next Monday.